While the headlines have diminished, the suffering has not. Across the Holy Land, the devastation of war and the humanitarian crisis it has caused continues. But what also continues is the Church helping the most vulnerable communities living on the margins, those who are facing displacement, poverty and uncertainty about their future. Shortly we'll hear from Auxiliary Bishop of Dublin, Paul Dempsey, and CEO of Trócaire, Seán Farrell, about their participation in the recent delegation known as the Holy Land Coordination Group. They'll share with us their experience in visiting the Holy Land. They will remind us how important it is for us as Catholics to give a voice for the voiceless, echoing the appeal of Cardinal Pizzaballa, whom they met on this trip. They urge prayer, solidarity and renewed pilgrimage so that, in Christ's words, believers may truly be salt of the earth and light of the world. So it's lovely to have you both with us today. Tell us a little bit then about this trip to the Holy Land. What was it all about?
Okay, well, I suppose first of all, Wendy, it's a trip that's organised by the bishops of England and Wales, and it's been done annually for many, many years. And we, as an Irish delegation, were part of it this year. We've been invited to be part of it for a number of years. It was under the title of Encounter and Dialogue with People of Hope. So obviously we knew we were going out to a very challenging situation, and we were going to see it firsthand after the whole situation of Gaza and the West Bank being in the news for a long time now, unfortunately for the wrong reasons. So we were going to see this, with our own eyes. But it's important, and I'm sure we'll chat about it, that the whole, I suppose, experience was about encounters with people of hope. And I think it's important to keep that alive in our hearts as we chat about the situation today. Yeah.
And you had lots of different encounters. Tell us the first place that you visited, John.
So we visited a number of places across the occupied West Bank. I suppose the thing that struck me about it was just meeting with communities. That when we got there late. The next morning we were on the road early, and we were down in the Jordan Valley, and we were at a Bedouin community. And two things really struck me. One, about just how difficult life is for Bedouin Palestinians. These are communities that have lived on this land for generations. They're mostly managing by having goats and sheep and small farms. And you could really see the pressure from Israeli settlers. So in the community that we visited, they took us to the top of the hill. The settlers have encroached on their land, and like many other Bedouin communities, they feel they'll be forced out in the next few weeks or months ahead.
Where do they go, Seán?
Well, this is the thing. Another community we went to, myself and Bishop Paul were in a community where people were actually packing up the day that we were there. They had an old battered car. They were packing up their few little pieces and belongings. And they said they were going to Jericho, and they were likely to settle in some sort of an informal settlement on the edge of Jericho. But people don't have a place to go, is the truth. These people are rooted in this land. This has been their land for generations. And sitting in that little place with the Bedouin community, especially speaking to the women from that community, it struck us that these are people that, are under huge pressure. There is massive Israeli government intention of driving them off this land.
There must be a lot of fear then.
Yeah, and you could feel it in them. And probably the sign of hope for us was we met with a couple of sisters who were working with them. And you could really see how the sisters were supporting them, that they were encouraging them. But the situation for a lot of Palestinian communities does remain incredibly dire.
The lovely thing too that Seán will remember, that when we were with the Bedouin community, and they were so welcoming to us, that they said about the Camboni sisters, they're an Italian Catholic order, and they're there working with these Bedouin people. But what was lovely to hear from the Bedouin people was that they said that nobody sees us but only you. So there was a lovely sense of solidarity from the sisters that they are there with these people, that they're not forgotten. And I think that was very much part of our pilgrimage to the Holy Land, that people are not forgotten. What I was very struck with about the whole experience of the Bedouin community was you could see actually the Israeli settlements up around on the surrounding hills. And they were telling us their experiences, like, that it was really a campaign of intimidation. So, their animals were being stolen maybe at night. There was literally maybe some people coming down at night throwing stones, physical stones at their little buildings that they were living in. Olive trees and little olive tree plantations were being destroyed. So this was the kind of the way that people were being put under pressure to move on.
Uninhabitable
Absolutely.
in a way,
Yeah,
facing the
yeah.
pressure in that way. The part of this pilgrimage, though, as you mentioned, hope was part of the theme. So where did you see hope in the religious sisters, in the people themselves?
Yeah, well, we met so many people, the Bedouin community. In fairness, what I found about them was there was a sense of joy about them. The smiles that came through. They were so delighted to welcome us to their community. They were so hospitable to us. We shared a lovely meal with them. They had put on a spread for us, which, was so lovely. So we enjoyed their hospitality. But I think that thing of being seen, that they weren't forgotten, I think that was giving them hope in a very, very real way. Now, we went on over the following days. We had a number of encounters with people that, even though it might seem small, are voices for hope. We very often used that scripture passage, of salt of the earth, that little sprinklings of salt, in a sense. These are like little sprinklings of hope in the Holy Land that are important to listen to. Because I suppose the danger at the moment, Wendy, is that, we might sort of say that, the war in the Holy Land is over, but the conflict continues. The tensions between peoples continue. And even though the world news moves on to other areas, and there's been some very high-profile areas highlighted in recent months, that we move on maybe from the Holy Land, and people start to think, well, sure, isn't that sorted? That's done and dusted,
But the
which it's not.
devastation from a humanitarian perspective
Absolutely.
it still remains and continues.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we had really interesting conversations with, for example, people in Gaza, with the parish in Gaza, and also, subsequently we've been talking a lot to the local organisations we work with in Gaza. So the cameras have moved on, there's no doubt about that. But 900,000 people are now living on the rubble in tents. At a time, like when we were there, it was cold.
Very cold. People think it's warm out there, but
warm,
actually it was colder than here.
Yeah, the winters are harsh.
And what about the access, being able to provide humanitarian aid? Because I think that was such an issue for a long time.
More is getting in, but still not enough.
Yeah.
And still not at the level. So one of the projects we fund as Trócaire is for prosthetic limbs for children who have lost arms and legs, and it's still difficult to get the equipment in to do that. It's also difficult to get the medical equipment in at the scale of which it's needed, because not just have 70,000 people died, but there's huge amount of people left injured. There's also been a complete absence of medical care and medicines. Most of the hospitals in Gaza are now destroyed, so even basic medical care remains challenging. But I suppose when I look at the whole visit that we did, one of the things that struck me very strongly in talking to people was the resilience of people. Like, despite the circumstances in which people find themselves, we found incredible resilience and I think incredible strength in the communities. From speaking to the communities in Gaza to meeting the different communities.
Yeah.
We were right across the West Bank. Like, we spent a whole day driving practically the whole length of the Jordan Valley. And we met lots and lots of people who were saying, this is our homeland. Yes, we are being driven from it, but we are resilient as people, and we are determined, to remain rooted in this land.
Yeah, and I think on that one too, like it's not all cut and dry. Like, there's Palestinians on one side and maybe the Jewish community on the other side. Like, we had the great privilege of meeting with people, various groups. Like, we met with rabbis for human rights. We met with two rabbis who were really articulate guys who were working very hard on the Palestinian side. In fact, the day we met with them, they were a little bit late for our meeting, and they were late because they were out literally planting olive trees with, Palestinian people. And it was so lovely to hear that. And they are voices for justice and for human rights, literally, in this place. We met with a Jewish woman, we met with a young Palestinian Christian and a young Jewish man as well. We were supposed to have a Muslim as part of that group, part of the Rosing Centre, and that's a centre for education and dialogue. And these people coming from very different backgrounds, but what they were trying to do was to say there is another way. that even though we come from very different traditions and maybe understandings and backgrounds, we can live and work together. And they're trying to be a voice maybe in schools and in maybe third level education places, you know, to try and get this message across. And I was very struck at that meeting, actually. The Jewish lady was saying to us that, you know, hope is not just some sort of shallow kind of optimism. Hope is something very real, something that you have to work with every day. And they were working at that. And they, you know, they were trying to show that hope is possible. And in fairness to, amazing coming from our own tradition, our own history of the difficulties that we've had in Northern Ireland, you know, that actually gave people in these situations hope as well. That we've obviously come from a very difficult background ourselves. Our history tells us that. But it also shows that there are possibilities and that there is hope for the future. And that inspired many people that we met in the Holy Land as well.
That idea that it's not just hope is more than a feeling, but it's a decision that you have to make you have to choose it, really.
Absolutely.
We were at, remember the meeting we were at, and there was a Jewish woman, there was a Palestinian Muslim man and a Palestinian Christian man. And I think it was probably one of the times that we all were struck the most, because all of them had lost a child in the conflict. And I suppose, as you think they are parents, and they've dealt with the trauma. Some of their kids were as young as 12 years of age when they were killed. And they all talked about what it was like losing a child. But they all said they were there out of that experience where they had gone beyond hatred and beyond the hatred of the other, to sit together and talk about trying to build peace and dialogue and build across the communities between Jew, Muslim and Christian. And to me, there was signs of hope in that. But one of the things you remember, going back to what she said, was that hope is not a feeling for her, that hope is an action. And that it's the actions we take that actually build hope. So that really struck me coming back, that here you had people who'd gone through the biggest trauma you could imagine in life, and they were still working together. They were trying to engage in their different societies, despite how difficult it is. And I think particularly in Israeli Jewish society, it is very difficult to have these conversations today about reaching across and seeing Palestinians particularly as equal, and seeing that Palestinians have a right and have a space and a right to the land in which they're on. And that those are difficult conversations at the moment in the context of, you know, what has happened in Gaza and what is increasingly happening across the West Bank.
Yeah, that was a very emotional meeting. I remember the group, there was you know, when something is happening, that there was a silence. Yes. You know, when you have parents talking to you about the pain of losing a child, you know, you're at a different level. But for people at that level to be able to say, look, we can live together, that you can see the good in the other side. They were part of what's called the Parents Circle. There's about 850 members of it, parents who have lost their own family, their own children. And again, they're trying to be voices in that difficult situation, but what powerful voices they are. And in fact, they visit different parts of the world, and we were just saying it'd be lovely maybe if we could bring some of them to Ireland someday, to share their experience of the hope and what's possible. And actually, I remember Seán asked a question that day, what gives them hope? And I remember the Palestinian man, the Muslim man, I remember, if I remember correctly, sort of said that Northern Ireland situation gave him hope. He said it might have taken you about 800 years to sort it out, but you did get there in the end. And, you know, that gave him hope.
When you think of the situation of those people who, as you say, Seán, it is the most unfathomable tragedy you can imagine, to lose a child, and in conflict. You can understand people saying, that's incredible, that human spirit, that hope in action, as you called it. So how can we put practical, is it political pressure to achieve what these people who have lost so much are trying to achieve in terms of, well, a two-state solution? And it's that political pressure on the Israeli government, or for people watching who are frustrated by...
I know, and we all get certain amount of frustration with it, because it seems so intractable, right? The political situation there seems so challenging. But I think for us, when we went there, like, one of the parts of it was we talked about the different P's. We talked about prayer, we talked about pilgrimage, we talked about presence, and we talked about pressure. So if I get to suppose your question is about the pressure bit, Wendy. What can we do and what can countries do? And I think it's clear now that, you know, when we look at what happened in Gaza and the genocide that happened, and then we look at the displacement of Palestinian communities across the West Bank, I think for me the intention is similar, which is about the removal of Palestinians on a grand scale from the lands that is their traditional homeland. And therefore we do need political pressure around this. We cannot stand by and allow this to continue and allow it to continue to the point where Palestinians will be now driven into small enclaves across the West Bank, where all the land will essentially be handed over to Israeli settler groups, and Palestinians will live in different stages of poverty and alienation in dense urban settings. That is creating a scenario for the future that is unthinkable. So for me, it is about political pressure. One of the things that we constantly talk about in Trócaire and constantly engage with government around is around the Occupied Territories Bill. We believe that if there are illegal settlements on Palestinian land, that we should not trade with those settlements. We should not economically advantage a process which is depriving Palestinians of their land. So we will continue to work on the presence, on the prayer, on the pilgrimage, and on the pressure.
Yeah, it's multifaceted.
It is
And it
multifaceted.
has to be.
And it has to be, because like you can work with communities at the grassroots, like we do in Gaza, say for example, providing humanitarian support, and we're doing that today. Be that, you know, people living in tents still need food and cooking equipment and medical attention, and we will continue to do that. We will continue to support organisations in both Palestine and Israel on the questions around human rights, be that representing communities with their land rights, helping them to go through the court system to protect their lands, etc. But I think one of the things that we also need to do is to work on the political pressure side, and that is about bringing attention to what is happening there, which is, I think, the annexation of the West Bank is now up for discussion. And I suppose buoyed by an American administration that have said everything is okay in terms of taking land and seizing land. And do you remember the day, Bishop Paul, where we were down in the Jordan Valley and they were showing us the maps of what the settlements have already taken and what they plan to take over the next 5 to 10 years, etc. So for me, it is, I think the brilliant thing about this visit and about the delegation was bringing those different elements to play.
When you even just share some of the experiences, it's lovely to hear those elements of hope. But still, I think most people would be very challenged by the level of suffering, the humanitarian crisis. And from a faith perspective, Bishop Paul saying, where is God in all of this? Did you find your faith being challenged, or how do you, keep the faith when you're seeing such suffering?
But to be honest with you, I was inspired from the faith perspective, Wendy, with the people I met and encountered, even though there are people that might come from different faith backgrounds or experience than what I would come from. And just what Seán was talking about there, you know, when we talk about Trócaire, which was set up by the Irish bishops in 1973, like there was kind of two founding pillars behind Trócaire. One was to reach out and to help those who are poor, and indeed through Trócaire's partners in the Holy Land, that's happening. But the other part of it was to be the voice for the poor, to raise awareness around these issues. And indeed, by the very fact that we're here today, Wendy, and that Trócaire speaks for this, and indeed the Irish Bishops' Conference speaks for this, that we're trying to be a voice for those who are voiceless. And that goes right back to the gospel. That's the message of Jesus Christ.
Being
you know
the
what I
voice
mean?
for the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. Like Jesus reached out to those whose voice were never heard. You know, so the whole work that we're talking about here is the work of the gospel. And I saw the work of the gospel in a very real way and a very live way when I was in the Holy Land. And that's an inspiration to me. That we must be a voice for justice in the world today, and that we don't allow these atrocities to happen. And sometimes that's not easy. And sometimes, you know, you have to stand up for this, and you have to be brave and be courageous. But that's what the gospel requires. But to encounter people like we were talking about, those parents who had lost a child, I don't know what that's like. But to see them speaking to us in such a profound way, to say there is a better way. that for me is the gospel coming alive. Seeing the Camboni sisters working with the Bedouin communities, lovely sister, one from Mexico, one from Italy, working with these out in the middle of nowhere in a very, poor area. But here was the gospel. Here were these sisters, working with these people in this desperate situation, one might say. There's the gospel alive and, very, very active in that situation. To see I suppose the different faith communities, be it the Muslim, the Christian, the Orthodox, the Jewish voices coming together. In a sense, that goes back to Nostra Aetate, the whole church call on kind of dialogue between different faith communities. That's important to keep that alive. And this is a very important place to keep that alive today. So I suppose in answer to your question, Wendy, the trip from a faith perspective for me was, something that gave me great life, great energy and great hope around my own faith. Now, there's another side, Seán talked about part of the whole experience was pilgrimage, and obviously pilgrimage meeting people. But we did have some lovely moments as well from the faith perspective. Like we had Mass down at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where it's the place of the burial and rising of Jesus. One of the things that's very notable in the Holy Land at the moment is actually the lack of tourists for kind of obvious reasons. And, I'm sure Seán is the same. But when I say to people, like a few weeks ago, I was in the Holy Land or I was in Palestine or whatever, people are a little bit taken aback. Like they're kind of saying, oh my God.
That's having its own impact.
Yeah, exactly.
Tourism,
the tourism. And actually, we met with Cardinal Pizzabella there. We had a lovely meeting with him and he was most hospitable to us when we were there. But one of the big messages, and I asked him this myself, I said, like, what message do you want us to bring home when we go back to our various countries as part of the delegation? And he said, bring pilgrimages. Now I know that's not so easy in this day and age, and it wasn't just about the economic thing of bringing people to bring, the whole economic.
That you are seen.
Exactly. Yeah. That they wanted people to be with them in the Holy Land. So it was very, very striking. It was a very emotional Mass that we had down at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was very early in the morning, a little bit like the scriptural passage, very early in the morning they went down to the tomb. This was talking about faith. This was it literally. And there was no one basically around. I was in the Holy Land once before, back in 2014, with a parish pilgrimage when I was in Newbridge. And, you could be queuing for hours to get to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And
selling its own.
Yeah, exactly. So they're not there. Completely empty,
Which was very special.
Very special for us,
also,
in a way, yeah.
Also sort of showed the signs that, many of the communities that we visited do rely on pilgrimages, particularly in Bethlehem.
They do, very much so.
And, that's just not happening. And I think if you look at the recent political manoeuvrings around potentially conflict with Iran, as much as the Cardinal would love to get pilgrimages back, I think we live in a reality where if there is conflict, people will not travel. And that's just the reality at the moment.
So what can people do I know there's people that are listening or watching to us saying, okay, I don't have political influence. You were talking about that earlier. I'm not going to be able to go on a delegation. So in our theme at the start, we're talking about hope, but I feel when we're talking about these types of situations and the level of devastation and suffering that's happening in the Holy Land, people feel hopeless. They feel, well, what can I do? So what can people do to help?
Well, the way I look on it is that we've now entered the season of Lent, and I suppose as we travelled in a car, we were talking about this. We were in a car travelling down the Jordan Valley, and when it talked about Jesus being in the wilderness, we were in this desolate area where Bedouins live. And we were both saying it's not the wilderness that we imagined when you first read that passage. It was rocky. It was, these areas of little mountains and rocks, etc. And while we were there, we were talking about, it's important to bring people on a journey with us into these stories and into the lives of these people who are being displaced. And for me, it's about, as we enter Lent, I think Trócaire gets incredible support from the people of Ireland. Churches all across the country have taken Trócaire boxes. Schools learn about the work of Trócaire. And we get a chance to reach into hundreds of thousands of homes and churches all over the country where people have the chance to support us. And that support, to me, then means we can continue to do the work that we do. And that is both the humanitarian work in Gaza, but also the work for justice and peace in both Palestine and Israel. And that's vitally important for us. But the other thing that people can do, I suppose, is to stay involved and interested in the wider world. And we know that there's a huge amount of other issues that people think about. But one of the things I suppose we said coming back was that we have the chance to continually talk to people about what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in Palestine, and that people remain interested and engaged.
I also think too that something that people can do, they can talk to their local representative, TD or whatever, to maybe talk about where are we at with the occupied territories
Yeah, this is
bill.
still important to me.
That's still very important. That's not gone off the agenda, and it has been seen in recent months that this is kind of stalling. So maybe a little bit more pressure needs to be put on there so that this can be followed through with. So I think people can do things like that. But also from a faith perspective, obviously to pray for people as well. They are our brothers and sisters, and to keep them in prayer and not to forget them. As I go back to that little saying that I said earlier on, that the women in the Bedouin community said, nobody sees us, only you. So not to forget people, but to remember them in prayer. And as I say, there are various other means by supporting Trócaire and the work that goes on in a very real way through our partners, but also, as I say, maybe talking to your local government representative as well.
Well, you certainly helped, I think, people today to do just that, to be able to see and to know what's happening and to be able to bring that then into their own lives practically and spiritually. Seán, Farrell, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks very much, Wendy.